Welcome to ETM Analytics' first take of the markets. As per usual, I'm joined by Director George Glynos. But George, before we start, did you know that South Africa, for the first time ever now, boasts with both the titles of strongest and fastest men in the world? Dino now became the first man out of Africa to win the strongest man in the world title yesterday, and Akani Simbini, oh man, he's just on a run of his own. We're running again sub 10 this week in Atlanta. So I hope these are kind of good omens, and Ramaphosa might want to, take some inspiration from these gentlemen as he enters the Lion's Den in Washington later this week. But before we get to that meeting, of course, the other focus point of this week is the budget heading back to Parliament. It's 3.0. Is it third time lucky? It seems like it's going to be.
I hope so. By the way, I knew about Simbini. I didn't know about the strongest man title too. So that's quite something. On top of the rugby, we're doing all right. So look, insofar as the budget is it's important. I don't want to place too much emphasis on what comes out of it, but do they have room to come up with some sense of fiscal consolidation without relying on tax increases? And I think the answer is yes. And the more I think about it, the more it becomes pretty obvious to me in chatting to Azar Jameen just last week, discussing this exact topic. We concluded that they're talking about plugging a fiscal hole of 75 billion. Firstly, that's over the next 3 years, so it's call it 25 billion odd per year, although you'd have to adjust those slightly lower in the beginning and slightly more at the end. So 25 billion in the context of an expenditure line item in the budget of about 2.5 trillion means 1% of their expenditure needs to be trimmed. That's all we're talking about here, is 1% of that expenditure that needs to be trimmed. Is it possible to find that 1% in wasteful expenditure? I would say undoubtedly it is. I don't think we would struggle too much if we had to do a Doge-style approach towards spending in South Africa. I think we could probably find that a little more easily than people realize. And become a little more efficient. I mean, we need to rethink our approach towards government. Historically, this government has used it as an employment vehicle. Well, it needs to stop. It's not an employment vehicle. It gets funded out of a tax base, and as such, needs to be kept as small as possible to ensure that the costs to the overheads for the government are kept to a minimum. And that's the way I think we need to think. We need to think about this budget in that sort of reformist mindset. So we need to think about prioritizing the private sector to take over from SOEs. That's very much Operation Vulindlela, and we need to encourage that. I would encourage it to go one step further and even think along the lines of partial privatization a la Telkom, and do that to Eskom and Transnet and the ports and others. I think that would be fantastic. Crowd in some private sector capital on top of skills and efficiencies that would bring, and reduce the need to bail out these state-owned enterprises. So shrinking government, basically, at the end of the day, is what I'm talking about. And crowding in the private sector is another thing that I'm talking about, and relying on the accountability that comes within the private sector, not having the ability to be bailed out at every turn, I think makes a massive difference. So, without getting into too bogged down in the specifics, I think this budget could be a really good, meaningful step forward. It's a wonderful opportunity for this government to change tack. I think the GNU has done its bit now. So let's see what comes out of it. But I'm mildly optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic, if you like, that this is going to be a much better budget than version 1 or version 2.
Well, cautiously optimistic is almost like S&P wrote it as well, as they changed their outlook from stable to positive. And one of the reasons, obviously, being that there's more political stability. So it's these small victories. And if we can just continue to build on them, we might be able to turn the massive ship and just head into a fiscal trajectory that's more sustainable for South Africa's fiscus. So, there's unlikely to be any massive surprises come Wednesday in this budget delivery, but at least it will get passed. It seems everyone is on board through the GNU. Obviously, we are hoping that Ramaphosa will be able to get a large victory in the White House. If you were in his shoes, George, how would you approach Donald Trump?
So I would leverage off some of the facts that are indisputable, and some of those facts I think he can introduce into the conversation. But over and above that, I think it would be really useful for him to start with the GNU. Interestingly enough, because I think just taking it one step further from what you were mentioning on the S&P ratings, is the fact that I see this as a really positive development. As you know, Ilze-Marie, we've been talking a lot more constructively about this GNU than many out there, and for the simple reason, we don't want it to be without friction. That's the whole point of a coalition government, is to get different perspectives to mesh together, and negotiations and whatnot. That's the whole point. So, we didn't want it to be a situation where everybody just listened to the ANC because they were the biggest coalition partner. And that's what we got. And I'm really pleased that we've gone down that road. And I think Ramaphosa can start off by just highlighting to Trump the fact that we are the ANC working together with the DA, two parties that it would have been unthinkable, 10 years ago, to be able to work together. One seen as a predominantly black party, and the other as representing the whites in this country, and yet they are working together, and they've done so constructively. And we are progressing towards a budget that has been, that is likely to pass through an easy, comfortable majority this time, if all the individual role players within the GNU vote in that favor. So I would start there. I would highlight that GNU and how the different parties are working together, and then you can get on to the other things. But Ramaphosa does have his work cut out for him. His government hasn't made it easy for him. There are a lot of inconsistencies in the way that South Africa portrays itself, and then what it does back home. And whether you're talking about geopolitically taking a very strong stance against Israel, for example, but not taking a stance at all against Russia. These are inconsistencies that he's going to have to try and explain. And I think he's going to have a pretty tough time in doing it. And I wouldn't be surprised if he gets tackled on many of these issues quite publicly. If he does get a dressing down a la Zelensky, at the end of the day, was it worthwhile going? Well, I think it was. You've got to clear the air in order to make room for any meaningful, constructive discussions in the future. So if that's all that this accomplishes this time around, then I think that it was still a worthwhile visit. And then you need to let the dust settle and then approach them again and again and again. But then you've also got to come back with the messages that are given to you. And you need to do something about that to be able to show your counterpart that you have actually heard them, you have addressed some of the concerns that they have, and that you are prepared to, involve yourself in negotiations and discussions that can sometimes be deeply uncomfortable. So that's what I would hope for that comes out of this thing. But and I will commend Ramaphosa on having the guts to do this, because I don't think it's an easy thing to do. Interestingly enough, I did notice that one of the ministers that he's taking with him is also one of his biggest critics, being John Steenhuisen, and I think that in itself is a really positive, powerful, strategic move.
Yes, and I think, Ramaphosa is going to be different to some of the other perhaps international leaders that Trump have met with in the recent months, purely because we are not that dependent and not that interlinked with the US. Yes, there's AGOA, I understand that, but our economy will move forward without US assistance if we have to. And Ramaphosa, in and of itself, in his nature, is he doesn't react to grandstanding and puppeteering by, with a loud reaction to it. He remains very calm. He remains very soft-spoken. He's very difficult, I think, to actually get a reaction from. So he might be different in that way. And of course, we know how some of the negotiations that Ramaphosa was involved with during Kudesa, they're infamous for how skilled he approached them and how he played his opponent. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And of course, we need to also just remember that Trump has changed his stance slightly towards Africa in this term. They announced another US-Africa summit that will be happening later this year, which Trump will host in New York for African leaders. And the undertone, if you look at that message, is a lot to do with commerce and trade. So we're seeing the stance perhaps change from a US policy perspective, from, more where aid and support and finance and collaboration is dependent and contingent on perhaps ideological outlooks or policies, to a more transactional based, a lot like what China did, like quid pro quo. We'll give you something and we must win and you must win, and then we can move forward, which is something he avoided in his first term. He did not host that summit, although his predecessor as well as Biden did. So we're seeing this shift happening because I think Washington is very aware that they need to maintain some influence in Africa. So that's an important undertone and context, I think, to this discussion. My only concern is what you mentioned as well, is that Ramaphosa might be walking into a situation where Trump perhaps have a preconceived idea of how he's going to handle the situation, and you have a Zelensky moment. Perhaps not of Ramaphosa's fault, but he might have made up his mind and decided, this is the example that I'm going to make. That is my only concern, and that is the only unknown. However, in any other situation, I see this, hopefully, and I'm rooting for him to be a very good diplomatic discussion. I don't know if you saw the engagement between Ramaphosa and Rwandan president last week as well on a stage. The media was reporting this frosty relationship between the two, and they sat on that stage, and Ramaphosa handled it so skillfully, so diplomatic. It was perfect. It was brilliant. So I'm hoping for a similar play out to happen in Washington this week. And then we will have to see. But who knows? Like I said, Trump could walk in and he could have slept funny and decided, no, today is not your day. So it's going to be an interesting week, but hopefully we will have a couple of victories scored for South Africa at the end of it.
I'm looking forward to a more positive week, both on the budget and I'm hoping that some sense of diplomacy prevails between both America and South Africa. And if we can just try and moderate our own geopolitical positions as a country. I think the majority of people in this country do not necessarily identify with the positions that this government has taken. And I'm not just referring to the Palestine thing. I'm talking about cozying up to Iran. I'm talking about cozying up to Russia over Ukraine. There's a lot that I think many people have problems with. And that these need to be buttoned down. South Africa needs to rethink its geopolitical position. It needs to understand that it's part of a global picture, that it is responsible in different sort of ways. By all means, you can hold people to account, but you also have to consider your own country and the implications for your own country of taking these principled stances. Unemployed people, we have an unemployment crisis. We need to literally do everything we can in order to resolve that before we resolve the rest of the world's issues.
Man, I wish I could be a fly on the wall of the White House this week. But George, we will then hopefully have some victories to chat about. Thank you very much for your time, and we will chat again next week.
Thank you.
Okay.